My stepmother erased my name from my father's obituary, but as co-trustee, I blocked her plans. 2 years later, she faced court, found guilty on 14 counts. My stepmother prevented me from attending my dad's funeral and removed me from his obituary. So I denied her his inheritance. I was 14 when my dad married Selena. She was everything you'd expect from a woman who used the term networking and referred to her nail technician as her therapist. On the surface, she was all smiles and expensive perfume. But behind closed doors, Selena acted as a gatekeeper for attention, affection, and eventually my dad. When Dad married her, she insisted on blending families, but what she really meant was that I should blend into the background. She had 2 adult children from her previous marriage who were both noisy, entitled, and allergic to jobs, and she ensured their needs came first. If Dad gave me $50 for a school trip, she'd huff and say, "Must be nice." My kids didn't get handouts like that. They did, all the time. If Dad planned a weekend with me, there was always an unexpected family emergency on her side that demanded his presence. By the time I turned 18, our relationship had been reduced to brief phone calls and the occasional lunch, which Mom was always too busy to attend. Then 2 years ago, Dad got ill. It wasn't the sort of illness you recover from. I learned about it from my cousin, not Selena, who apparently didn't want to bother me. By the time I got to the hospital, she had already established control over who could visit, when, and for how long. I was allowed a few hours a week, but only if she was there to monitor. When I asked Dad about it, he just sighed and said, "Let's not make things harder than they have to be." That was his way of avoiding conflict, but I saw it in his eyes. He wanted me there. A few months later, I got the call. Dad was gone. I cried until my chest hurt. Then I inquired about the funeral. Selena's voice was sharp when she said, "I don't think it's appropriate for you to come." I thought I misheard. "I'm his child. And I'm his wife," she snapped. "This will be a private affair for people who were really part of his life." I struggled to breathe. "I am part of his life." "Not in the way that matters," she responded before hanging up. I drove to her house that night, angry, but she refused to answer the door. The next day, I tried again. Still nothing. Finally, I called her from a different number. She picked up with the fake sweet voice she used on strangers. But when she realized it was me, she added, "If you show up, I'll have security remove you." I didn't believe she'd go that far until I saw the obituary. My name wasn't mentioned at all. It listed her children as his cherished family, but left me out completely. I can't describe the pain it causes. It wasn't just losing my dad. It was being cut out of his life story while his body was barely cold. So I stayed home the day of the funeral. I sat on my couch, holding one of Dad's old flannel shirts, trying to breathe through the grief and anger. But as time passed, something shifted. I realized that if she could bar me from saying goodbye, I could bar her from the cozy little world she'd built for herself. This is where the story gets important. Dad had managed his finances wisely. He had a will that he updated after marrying Selena. She assumed she'd get everything. She was wrong. Dad had left me a 50% share of their house, plus control over a small trust for property taxes and upkeep. I hadn't acted on it while Dad was alive, partly out of respect and partly to avoid starting a fight. But once she banned me from his funeral, the gloves were off. Within a week, I met with an attorney. We reviewed the deed and trust terms. Legally, Selena couldn't sell or refinance the home without my sign-off. She couldn't even do major renovations without my okay. I also served as a co-trustee for the trust. That meant any expense she wanted had to go through me. I didn't say anything to her at first. I just started exercising my rights quietly and deliberately. She wanted to renovate the kitchen, denied. She wanted to throw a big holiday party, not without the event insurance I required for any gathering over 20 people. She wanted the trust to pay for landscaping, but only if she used the budget-friendly service I recommended. At first, she tried to ignore me. Then she tried to charm me. When that didn't work, she blew up, accusing me of trying to destroy her life. I calmly reminded her, "I'm just protecting my dad's assets, you know, the man whose funeral you banned me from." It took her less than 6 months to put the house on the market. She couldn't stand living in a place where she had to ask my permission to paint a wall. When it sold, I got a portion of the proceeds enough to cover the down payment on my own home. The best part was that word spread among the family about what she'd done. She thought she controlled the narrative, but people started asking why I hadn't attended the funeral. I told the truth. Now she's the one not welcome at family gatherings. I never got to say goodbye to my dad the way I wanted, and I'll never forgive her for that. But every time I unlocked the door to the home I bought with the money she thought she'd keep, I imagined Dad smiling, knowing I hadn't let her win. But just when I thought it was over, I got a call from the hospital. That was the truth about my dad's death. I was unpacking boxes in my new living room when my phone rang with an unknown number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Marissa Torres, and she had worked as a nurse in the ICU where Dad died. Her voice was shaky as she told me she couldn't stay quiet about what happened to him. My fingers trembled so badly that I had to put down the photo frame I was holding. She wouldn't say much over the phone, only insisting that we meet in person at a coffee shop called Neutral Grounds, about 20 minutes from the hospital. I agreed to meet her the next morning, even though my mind raced with 1,000 possibilities about what she might know. I couldn't sleep the entire night, replaying every memory from Dad's last days in the hospital. When I walked into Neutral Grounds the next day, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes waved me to a private booth. She had a manila envelope on the table and kept her hand on it, as if afraid someone would grab it. Before I could even sit, she pushed the envelope toward me and told me to look at Dad's medication logs from his final week. The papers inside showed dose after dose of painkillers, each higher than the last, and none matched what his doctors prescribed. Selena's signature was on every authorization as his healthcare proxy. According to the notes, Dad's morphine levels tripled in just 3 days, even though his condition was improving. Marissa leaned forward and explained how she'd tried to raise concerns with the hospital administrator, Dr. Adrian Kessler, but he brushed it off and changed her schedule so she couldn't be near Dad's room anymore. She said 3 other elderly patients who used Selena as a proxy had the same pattern. They all died within weeks, leaving large estates. My stomach sank when I realized this might be bigger than just my dad. After leaving the coffee shop, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, unable to even start the engine. My hands were shaking when I called Rowan Russo, the estate attorney, and left a voicemail asking for urgent advice about Dad's death. The concrete walls of the garage felt like they were closing in as I struggled to process the possibility that Selena had murdered my dad. Rowan called me back within an hour, and I could hear the concern in his voice as I described what Marissa had shown me. He told me to document everything, make copies of all the papers, and file a complaint with the medical board immediately. When he asked if I was prepared for Selena to face murder charges, I said yes without hesitation. I spent the entire weekend at my kitchen table sorting medication logs and mapping out Dad's last days with sticky notes and highlighters everywhere. Every detail I remembered about Selena's behavior started to change, like her insistence on being alone with the doctors and her control over who knew about his health. The way she hovered over the nurses when they gave his meds seemed less concerned and more like she was making sure they followed her orders. 2 days later, my cousin Alara called me out of the blue, saying she'd heard from other relatives that I'd been asking questions about the funeral. She said she had something I needed to see and asked if she could come over right away. When she arrived, she pulled out her phone and played a recording she'd secretly taken at the funeral while Selena was outside taking a call. Selena's voice was clear as day as she assured someone that the issue was taken care of and the estate would be settled soon. Alara thought it was odd at the time, but didn't think much until she heard I was looking into something. I immediately called Rowan and met him at his office the next morning with all the evidence we'd collected so far. He'd already pulled the estate papers and discovered that Selena had filed paperwork to expedite probate just 2 days after the funeral, which he thought was unusually quick for someone supposedly grieving. The timing of everything, the med changes, the rushed probate filing, the call at the funeral, suggested Selena had planned this for months. That night, Marissa texted me that Dr. Kessler had been asking other nurses about her, wondering if she'd talked to anyone about past patients. That med log reveal made me wonder what Selena's real strategy was here. The timing of those dose increases seemed too convenient for someone already eyeing the kitchen for upgrades. She was worried he'd find out she'd contacted me and didn't know what to do. I told her to act normal and go to work like nothing had changed. While Rowan was preparing formal complaints to file with the medical board and the local DA's office, I needed some fresh air. So I drove to Riverside Park, where Dad used to take me fishing every Saturday morning before Selena entered our lives. The wooden benches were frost-covered, but I sat anyway, staring at the frozen pond where we'd caught bluegill and talked about everything except what really mattered. The last time I saw him awake enough to talk. 2 weeks before he died, he held my hand and started to say something about Selena before stopping himself and just squeezing tighter. His eyes had this look that I couldn't place at the time, but now knew was a mix of fear and regret. He knew something was wrong but didn't have the strength to fight it. A week later, my phone rang at 2 a.m., and I almost didn't answer the unknown number. Dorian's voice was slurred and angry as he ranted about his mother acting strangely since the funeral. He said she'd been burning papers in their backyard fire pit all week and kept calling a guy named Adrian at odd hours. I switched my phone to record as he rambled about finding shredded financial docs in the trash and overhearing her yelling at someone for not delivering the info. He repeated Adrian's name 3 more times before hanging up mid-sentence. Rowan filed the formal complaint with the healthcare board 2 days later, including Marissa's med logs and Alara's recording from the hospital parking lot. The board responded with a form letter, saying they'd opened an investigation that would take at least 60 to 90 days for initial review. I wanted to scream at the timeline, but Rowan reminded me that solid cases take time to build right. My phone rang the next afternoon, and it was Selena's number for the first time since she'd banned me from Dad's funeral. Her voice dripped with fake kindness as she asked how I was doing and added that she'd heard I'd been questioning Dad's care. She said she didn't want me getting obsessed with conspiracy theories when I should be focusing on healing and moving on. The threat hung between us, and I stayed silent, letting her reveal more with each tense word. She added that Dr. Kessler was concerned I was harassing his staff and that I might need professional help to cope with my grief. I remained quiet, and she hung up after warning me that spreading lies about good people had consequences. Marissa texted me to meet at a downtown Starbucks the next morning, where she slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were printouts from a charity website showing Selena and Adrian on the same hospital foundation board 15 years ago, before Dad met her. There were photos from galas where they posed together smiling, plus donor lists showing they'd co-sponsored various events over the years. Marissa showed a newspaper article about the foundation being investigated for financial irregularities. Selena stared me in the eye right before she left the board and told me this wasn't coincidence and that she believed Dad had been targeted from the beginning. The next week, Rowan summoned me to his office, where he had estate docs spread across his conference table like a crime scene. Selena had tried to refinance Dad's house 3 times in the year before he died, but each application was denied because the trust required my approval. The loan amounts increased each time, starting at $200,000 and ending at $500,000. The last application was filed about 2 weeks before Dad went into the hospital for what was supposed to be routine surgery. Rowan pointed out that each denial letter cited the trust structure protecting my inheritance as a barrier. My apartment was too quiet that night as I lay in bed, replaying every interaction with Selena since she married Dad. I remembered her expression when Dad told her he'd revised his will to protect my share of everything they owned together. She'd smiled, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her wine glass and talked about how families should fully trust each other. Even then, the way she said trust felt threatening, but I was too young to understand it. Alara showed up at my door 3 days later with her laptop and a USB drive full of photos from the funeral. She'd been in the parking lot during the service I'd been barred from and saw Selena meeting with Adrian by the dumpsters. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., while everyone else was inside eating finger sandwiches and sharing memories I wasn't allowed to hear. Adrian was flailing his arms and pointing at Selena, and she was holding up her hands as if to calm him. In one photo, his face was red and aggressive, and Selena looked scared for the first time. 3 weeks after her first outreach, Marissa texted me in panic, saying the medical board had contacted her for a formal interview that morning. By noon, she'd been suspended from work pending an internal review into patient privacy violations and unauthorized access to records. She was crying when she called, saying she couldn't afford to lose her job and license with 3 kids at home. Rowan rushed to the hospital with paperwork for a whistleblower protection claim, arguing her suspension was illegal retaliation for reporting potential patient harm. He also served subpoenas on all patient files where Adrian was the attending physician and Selena was listed as the family contact or healthcare proxy. The next morning, Alara called and asked me to come over because she'd found some old photo albums from family events. I went to her modest kitchen, where she had boxes all over the table. We started going through pictures from 2 years back, when Dad looked completely healthy and robust. Alara pointed to one where he was carrying her kid on his shoulders at a birthday party. She quietly said he should have had at least 10 more good years. I nodded and kept flipping when the phone rang with Dorian's name on the screen. His voice sounded different this time, sober and scared instead of drunk and mad. He told me his mother had been moving money between accounts all week. She mentioned Adrian's plan falling apart and the need to cover their tracks. He was starting to think his mom was involved in something really bad. I told him to write down what he remembered and called Rowan's office right away. 2 days later, I met with Marissa at a park near the hospital, where she burst into tears. She kept saying she couldn't afford to lose her nursing license or her job with 3 kids at home. I promised to pay all her legal fees, plus any lost wages, as a result of this mess. I assured her that my dad would have wanted the truth to come out, no matter the cost. She wiped her eyes and hugged me before walking back to her car. Rowan called me from his office that afternoon, sounding worried for the first time since I'd met him. Selena's lawyer had sent him a cease and desist letter, threatening to sue for defamation if I kept spreading what they called malicious falsehoods. Rowan immediately filed a formal criminal complaint with the Milwaukee Police Department on the same day. He said the threat just proved they were scared and we were on the right track. After almost a month of paperwork and waiting, my phone rang with an unknown number. The woman introduced herself as Detective Calla Monroe from the Milwaukee Police Department's fraud unit. She wanted to schedule an interview about my dad's death and the claims we'd submitted. She said they were conducting a formal probe into suspected healthcare fraud and elder abuse at the hospital. The probe was officially underway, and they'd be contacting everyone involved for statements. 3 nights later, around 11 p.m., someone knocked on my door, which scared me because I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Lyra standing there, looking terrified and glancing over her shoulder. When I opened the door, she practically fell inside and started talking fast about her mother. She'd overheard Selena on the phone with Adrian, discussing how to tie up loose ends before the probe got deeper. Lyra was convinced her mom would target her next because she knew too much about their relationship. I grabbed my keys and drove her straight to Rowan's office, even though it was nearly midnight. He met us there and took Lyra's written statement, in which she spilled everything she knew about her mom's activities. She explained that Selena had used her old nursing textbooks to study certain drugs and their interactions. This research started months before my dad got sick, which made things much worse. Lyra gave us screenshots of her mom's notes on dosages and combo effects. The next week, Detective Monroe brought Adrian into the downtown police station for questioning. Adrian looked nervous and kept wiping sweat from his brow during the interview. He argued that Selena was just a caring wife, making normal medical decisions for her sick husband. But when the detective pressed about the pattern of similar deaths and his long history with Selena, he clammed up. He kept changing his story and contradicting himself, as noted in the detective's report. Meanwhile, I searched the storage unit where I'd kept Dad's things after selling the house. I found a journal he'd been keeping in his last months that I had no idea existed. His handwriting got shakier as the pages went on, and he described feeling foggy after Selena's visits. He wondered if his prescriptions were right and why he felt worse after she helped him take his pills. Reading about his mixed feelings about trusting his wife while suspecting something was off made me sick. The next day, Rowan got a call from Marissa's lawyer with some surprising news. 2 more nurses from the hospital had contacted them, expressing similar worries about Adrian. They'd been too afraid to speak up before, but Marissa's courage inspired others to come forward. After that, the probe picked up speed, and Rowan suggested we meet with the detective again to go over everything we'd found so far. 6 weeks had passed since the first hospital call, and I was starting to feel like we were making progress when I ran into Selena at a grocery store near my new home. I was loading groceries into my car when I heard her voice behind me. My whole body froze. She was standing between 2 cars, blocking my path, and her face looked different, thinner and older. She stepped closer, and I could smell the same expensive perfume she always wore, but it made me want to throw up. "You have no idea what you're ruining," she said in a low voice that didn't sound like her. I pulled out my phone and started recording without thinking, holding it at my side while making sure it was aimed at her. She kept talking, claiming that my dad was going to die anyway and that this way had meant something, whatever that meant. Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking around, as if afraid someone would see us together. I told her to leave, but she grabbed my arm and squeezed hard enough to leave bruises. When another shopper approached and asked if everything was okay, Selena let go immediately, putting on her best fake smile. She walked away quickly, but not before warning me that I'd regret it because I didn't understand what I was doing. My hands were so shaky I couldn't drive home, so I called Rowan right away to tell him what happened. He had me come to his office immediately, and we played the recording for Detective Monroe, who listened to it 3 times before calling for backup. The detective said Selena had basically confessed on audio, and an arrest warrant would be issued soon. 2 cops went to her house that afternoon, but she was already gone. Her car was still in the driveway, and neighbors reported seeing her load bags into a cab earlier that morning before she confronted me at the store. The inside of the house was a mess, with drawers open and clothes strewn like she'd packed in a hurry. Dorian called me crying that night, which was unusual because we'd never talked much before. His mom had drained their joint bank account and left him a note saying she'd contact him once things settled. She'd taken everything, including money from his sister Lyra's college fund, and just vanished without telling her own kids where she was going. He kept yelling he couldn't believe she'd leave them like that, but I wasn't surprised, because Selena only cared about herself. The medical board started reviewing Adrian's other cases after learning about the probe, and what they found turned everyone's stomach. Over 5 years, they discovered 17 patients who died under suspicious circumstances, and each had assets and a connection to either Selena or Adrian. Some were Selena's country club friends, others Adrian's own patients transferred from other doctors. The patterns were the same, with prescriptions changed right before death and family kept away in their final days. On paper, each death looked natural, but put together, it was clear something horrific had occurred. 2 months had gone by since that first hospital call when I finally visited Dad's grave for the first time, since the funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. I'd been putting it off because I wasn't sure I could handle it, but I needed to tell him what was happening. The cemetery was quiet, and I sat on the cold ground, talking to his headstone about the investigation and promising to get justice for him. Alara showed up while I was there, and she must have known I'd finally mustered the courage to go, because she just sat beside me without saying a word. We held each other, and I cried harder than I had since his death, finally letting myself feel the pain I'd been holding back while fighting Selena. Rowan called me to his office the next week because the FBI had gotten involved when Selena crossed state lines, and they suspected interstate fraud was part of it. They said she'd been tracked to a motel in Chicago, but she was using a fake ID, and they were still trying to pinpoint her exact spot. The agent said it was just a matter of time before they found her, but I could tell they were frustrated she'd gotten such a head start. Adrian was arrested that same day in the hospital lobby in front of all his coworkers and patients. They charged him with healthcare fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. Marissa was watching from across the lobby as they cuffed him. She looked sad even though she'd been vindicated because the whole situation went against everything doctors were supposed to stand for. The probe grew, and 17 families eventually filed a class action lawsuit against the hospital, Adrian, and Selena. Rowan and I spent hours going over all the case files, and the hospital's insurance company was already pushing for a settlement because they knew how bad it would look in court. Lyra showed up at Rowan's office one day and asked to meet, bringing a laptop full of emails between her mom and Adrian. They'd been using the phrase, the Milwaukee Protocol, as code for their scam, and she had dozens of exchanges where they discussed which patients to target and how to split the money. The detective offered her immunity in exchange for her cooperation, and she looked relieved to finally unload what she knew. I wasn't sleeping or eating well anymore, and I kept checking the locks on my doors, afraid Selena would show up at my new home, even though the FBI said she was hundreds of miles away. 3 days later, Rowan called me at 6 a.m., his voice shaking with excitement. The FBI caught Selena at Chicago's O'Hare Airport as she attempted to board a flight to Costa Rica with a fake passport and $90,000 in cash. They pulled her off the plane in handcuffs while other passengers recorded on their phones. Within 12 hours, she was back in Milwaukee, sitting in a holding cell at the county jail. The judge set her bail at $2 million, which she couldn't post. They charged her with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and financial fraud totaling over $300,000. I watched the news from my couch, and my hands shook every time they showed her mugshot. 2 weeks later, I had to see her in person for her arraignment. The courthouse was packed with reporters, and I wore sunglasses even though it was overcast. Selena walked into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked 20 years older, with gray roots showing in her hair and deep lines around her mouth. Her lawyer stood next to her in an expensive suit as the judge read the charges. Selena kept her chin up and stared straight ahead, as if she were attending a board meeting instead of facing life in prison. When the court asked for her plea, she said not guilty in a clear voice that twisted my stomach. I noticed she was still wearing Dad's wedding ring and the diamond earrings he gave her for their anniversary. After the hearing, Dorian and Lyra waited for me in the hallway. They both looked terrible, with dark circles under their eyes, and Dorian's hands were shaking even worse than mine.